Well, of course, it is at one level the most glamorous job in the world, and at another level, there is absolutely no glamour whatsoever in it, because this bit of it, the travelling and the talking about stuff and the meeting people, is absolutely extraordinary. But the other bit of it, which is the literal living in your head, is excruciating and lonely and full of solitude and full of self-doubt, and very painful. And it's easily said that, but it is absolutely true. You know, the last three novels, these historical novels set in the Renaissance, have taken nearly 9.5 years of my life, and that will be divided up to maybe a year researching. I will spend a year in libraries, the British Library in London, the Warburg Centre. I will then spend some time in Italy, but I swear I don't have fun all the time, right? I will then spend quite a lot of time not knowing what I'm doing before I start, and then the writing can take anything from 9 months to a year and a half, depending on how much I stumble and how much I get lost. So, kind of blow for blow, the fun bit is smaller than the not fun bit. Having said that, I do the best job in the whole world, and I never look at a clock. That's an amazing thing to say about one's life. You know, so when I start writing at 9 o'clock in the morning after I've gone for a swim and I've had my first cappuccino, I will then carry on working until I can't work anymore, and maybe around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, when I feel faint, I realize I haven't eaten, so I have to go downstairs and shove some toast in my mouth and then come back out and carry on writing. But it's never about when can I stop. Even when I don't know what I'm doing and I'm in trouble, it's me and it. It's you're not aware that you're in it because you're in it.
How do you know when to stop that?
I think you get scared that you can't write anything. Well, two things happen. So, for instance, Sacred Hearts, this novel, probably took me 10 or 11 months to research. Now, some of that was actually in the city of Ferrara, where the convent in which the novel is set still exists. Ferrara still has 2 enclosed convents where the nuns have gone in at certain ages and not come out again. So part of my research is to be in that city, to feel what that city would have been like, and it's actually an easy job because Ferrara, I so recommend this, guys. Next time you decide that you need a holiday and you're going to go to Italy, don't go to Venice or Rome or Florence. Pick one of the little cities that people don't know about as well, right? And that northeastern corner with cities like Padua and Verona and Mantua and Ferrara are absolute gold mines because they're not full of tourists and the history is kind of almost still lying on the ground. It's like you can still see bits of gold on the ground. So I spend a lot of time there, and then I'll spend a lot of time in the library reading huge numbers of books, many of which are very recent because this study of particularly of women's lives within the Renaissance is a very modern phenomenon. And then I will get to a point almost like the end of too much Chinese food where I'll begin to feel stuffed. And by then, usually I will have maybe a couple of images in my mind. I'll certainly have got some characters, right? So before I started Sacred Hearts, I absolutely knew how the book was going to begin. I knew that the book was going to start in a cloistered convent late at night when it was very silent after the nuns had done their last service and gone to bed, and they need to sleep because they got up 5 hours later for the service in the middle of the night. And I knew the first thing you were going to hear was a young girl screaming her lungs out because she didn't want to be there. She'd just been put in there. So what happens is, by the time I've got to the end of the research, I've got images tugging at me. I've got sounds, I've got smells, I've got ideas coming to me. And that's the point when I put the research aside. Now, during the book, I may then get into trouble. And I may discover there's something I don't know enough about. And at that point, I can go back to the research to kind of give myself a kind of IV drip of more history. But by then, I'm usually into the story, and even if it's causing me trouble, I'm in it. I'm in the convent, not the library anymore. I used to say, and I said it truthfully, which is absolutely take me back to that period, but make me a man, because life was so tough for women. over the course of these 3 books, I've investigated 3 kind of roles, which were certainly historically accurate for women. In The Birth of Venus, there's a young girl, very well educated, very talented, with a piece of chalk and a pencil, who wants to paint. The only way she can even stay out of a convent is to get married. So you look at what happens when young women get married and how far they can fulfill any kind of ambition within the family. In The Company of the Courtesan is literally about courtesan culture, high class prostitution, which takes place in Renaissance Italy, particularly in Renaissance Italy, because it's where the church is centered, right? This is a very shocking fact, although it wasn't shocking then at all, which is by the late 15th century, the church and early Catholicism is so corrupt that all of the people who work within the Catholic Church take vows of celibacy, i.e. they will not get married, the point being that you don't want families which dissipate the wealth of the church, right? But they're not intending on being chaste, right? The women have to be chaste, celibacy and chastity if you're a nun. The men do not. And what happens is courtesan culture is born in Rome in the second half of the 15th century, because you've got bishops, you've got all the people who work for the church who need and want to have sex, right? They can't have it with women of their own class because they're being married off or put into convents. It's really not okay, right? They don't want to go into the streets because syphilis and varying sexual diseases are being passed around. What they sort of want is almost fake aristocratic women who are intelligent, who are beautiful, who run nice households, who can discuss Plutarch, who can play the lute, who can crack a joke, and at a certain moment go into the back room and have sex with them. And that's where courtesan culture grows up. And then the third option is a convent, and it's not even an option. Something like half of all well-bred women by the end of the 16th century are in convents because it's so expensive to marry them off to a flesh and blood husband, because you have to pay dowries. And dowries are inflating because it's an economically, powerful period. So actually my question now, and it's not just to me, in fact it's to any woman around now, is so which one would you have been, right? Would you have been the one who got married, taken the risk that you didn't love your husband, you didn't like your husband, taken the risk that as soon as you started having children, it didn't stop, 20, 25 children if you were married at the age of 14, you may well die in childbirth, a number of your own children will die in infancy, and if you want to do anything else, forget it. Do you become a high-class courtesan? Well, you've got to be smart, and you've got to be gorgeous, and you've got to be cunning, and you've got to know that it won't last for very long to do that. Or do you go into a convent? And that, in a sense, was where the 3 novels end up, because it looks like it's terrible from the outside. Of course, I don't want to go in there. I have to go in there. But what my research threw up was it actually wasn't that awful for a number of women.
Yeah, look, in reading In the Company of the Courtesan, you actually can forget that they're prostitutes, if you see what I mean. You make it sound, in lots of ways, even though obviously there's the reality of it, just amazing. They run their lives as businesses.
Yeah.
And it's 24 hours a day. And one of the really interesting things I thought about that is that they get no time off, and the really successful ones are great businesswomen.
Yes, yes. And also, the other interesting thing is, it takes us back to art, the really successful ones are not proto-feminists. You might go back into history thinking, oh yeah, high-class courtesans, I can write about that. That will speak to us modern women. Well, of course, you do yourself a great disservice if you think they're like us. Because in fact, they're not. By very definition, there is no such thing as sisterly solidarity. For the 10 or 15 or 20 years that you can make it, you're making it because you're better and more successful than the Protestant down the road, or whatever. So your whole life is spent self-absorbed with what you look like, making sure you can still play the lute beautifully, making sure that your palazzo looks better than the, etc., etc. When I was reading a lot of fiction growing up, I very often was reading fiction where boys were the heroes. So I got very good at crossing gender in order to inhabit the central characters, right? I'd just be the boy, right?
Yeah.
I'd be me.
And I mean,
the
it
boy.
still is. There is still obviously.
And
a lot of that.
when we have this debate about who reads fiction, men versus women, I regularly read tons of fiction written by men about men, where I inhabit That's an act of the imagination, right? A good writer allows you to inhabit masculinity. I read Philip Roth, who is an aging man, terrified of death, terrified of loss of potency, who writes about how he feels about it and his attitudes to women. I read J.M. Coetzee, who does some of the same things. And I enter through their imaginative writing, their masculinity. It's really fascinating. It's very different from my own experience. So to a certain extent, I absolutely expect men to be able to do the same thing with women, and particularly within history, you know. History, until very, very recently, really was written by the victors. And the victors were dead white males. I mean, it is within my lifetime. I studied history at Cambridge University. By the time I left in 1972, there was the beginning of an inkling that there was another kind of history to be told. It starts with Marxism, right? It's the only place where Marxism has any success in the world I can see is in history, right? Because it asks questions about the working class. It says, where are they in our history of great kings and great queens and battles and empires, right? Hot on the heels of Marxism, feminism arrives, goes, excuse me, half the population, what were they doing? Gender studies comes in, gay men and women go, did we just become gay 2.5 years ago? And what was happening there? People of other races come in and go, oh, so there were slaves, right? Could we actually examine what it meant to be a slave? And suddenly, history has changed. And it's changed no more powerfully than within women's history. These 3 books could not have been written even 25 years ago, because the research that has gone into them, into understanding what it was like in prostitution, understanding what it was like in convents, by generations of young scholars who've gone into state archives, parish churches, read really dry historical stuff in order to try and trace and tease out some of the facts about women's lives. You just couldn't have written it. And I feel quite passionately about this because, you know, historical fiction is still very much seen as will or will not Anne Boleyn give in to Henry VIII tonight, you know. And there's a bit of me that gets very angry about that because there's a deeper, more powerful, more hidden history to be told now. And it's not, gosh, if I were reincarnated, I certainly would have been Cleopatra. Because we wouldn't. If we had been in the past, the people in this room, we would have been ordinary. But we would have had stories. We would have had lives. We would have made some of it work, and some of it would have overwhelmed us. So to go back to your story, I have to tread a very delicate line. It is not my job as a feminist, which I am proud to call myself, except when somebody asks me in a radio interview and then I ask them to define the word before I agree to tell them I am one, because they can sometimes mean something very different from me. You know, it's not my job as a feminist to say, hey girls, it was all great, really, and we were all Joan of Arc. But it's also not my job to say we were all oppressed and it was absolutely awful and it was the worst thing that ever happened. Like everything in life, there were grey areas. Some women were strong, some women had personalities which fitted, some women found ways to creatively live within the cracks. Other women were destroyed by it. You know, people in convents were destroyed by it. I'll give you one example from one source, right? Galileos Daughter, which is a book written by a woman called Dara Sobel, right, looks at the lives of the 2 illegitimate daughters that Galileo had, both of whom were put into a convent. The older one writes letters to her father. We don't have his letters back to her, but we have her letters. After the success of that book, Dara Sobel translated all of the letters from Italian into English. I, of course, read them because they're great research. Most of them are actually pretty dull. They're about day-to-day life in the convent. Dear Father, I've sent you a pannier full of pickled walnuts. If you could send the pannier back, I need it because now we're going to do some... then can you send me your lace collars to mend? And I need a few more scudi to get a better cell. It's all quite boring, interesting for me, but boring for you. But in the middle of a letter, the following happens. Dear Father, I'm so sorry I haven't written for a while. We've had a crisis in the convent. The novice mistress has tried to kill herself. We heard screams coming out of her cell, and we went in, and she was beating her head against the walls of the cell, right? She had blood all over her. We managed to get her back and put her on the bed, but somewhere she'd found a knife from the kitchen. And she stabbed herself 13 times in the chest and the abdomen. And we got the knife away from her and we've strapped her down on her pallet now, and the surgeon doctor is coming, but she's bleeding profusely and we think she's going to die. Meanwhile, if you could send the punnet back to me, I'll be able to carry on with the walnuts. Now that is one incident in one letter from one nun in one convent that has been by chance kept by history, right? And in fact, I use it in the book. It's one of the many, many details that just gets kind of platted into a larger story. So I think some women went mad. I think some women could not handle it, but others did. Others found creative things to do.
Is it easy for you, the writing?
I think it's like absolutely everything in life that looks very easy. It's because you practice. Right, you know, I can't play the piano. I play the piano extremely badly. It's because I learnt until I was 16, then gave up for 30 years, right? Probably if I carried on playing the piano daily, although, let's put it, you know, I wouldn't be on a concert stage, I would be playing much better. I have spent a long time apprenticing and learning my craft of storytelling, right? I have been writing novels for the best part of 25 or 30 years now, and I cut my teeth as a storyteller writing thrillers, writing contemporary thrillers. And there is no better apprenticeship for learning how to tell stories, because the whole basis of a thriller is you have to pick up your reader by the first page and make them want to carry on reading until you get to the last page. There's drawbacks with those stories. They have to end neatly, and you have to read them fast, so there's no time for nuance and character. But it's a very, very good way of learning the craft of storytelling. So I am always thinking about how the pacing of a novel's going. I'm always thinking about when I need to move the reader on, right? I have done it a lot. And then I have times when I get lost and don't know what I'm doing, but you're not there for those bits, right? You get the novel when it's finished. You don't get the novel. My children are the ones who get the bits in the middle. There's a legend in our house that I'll come down from a day's work, whatever novel it is, and I'll sit down and they'll go, well, and I'll go, it's absolutely awful. This is the worst. It's worse it's ever been. I can't do it. And they'll go, right, so that would be very similar to the last time that it was the worst it's ever been. And I'll go, no, I'm sorry, you really haven't understood what I've said. That was last time. This really is worse. And they'll go, yes, and that's just like the last time too. So you don't see those bits, and I'm making a joke about them, but they are there.
How do you get through them?
You just keep on keeping on.
Right.
There is no other way to get through them. Sometimes you go back to research and that jogs. Sometimes you just sit in it. And you sit in it almost, if this doesn't sound too flip, until you get bored by your own anguish. It's almost as if it's a kind of form of early depression, when in the end you go, so get the hell out, Sarah, go and do something to shift the mood. And eventually something comes. It's always because you're looking for somewhere to go. And it's going to be more interesting if you don't just make an arbitrary decision. It's going to be more interesting if it grows out of the moment that you're writing. But I have learnt, if it doesn't sound too flip, that being lost and being afraid is part of the process of writing, right? And if you don't want to have those feelings, don't start writing, because almost every writer I know has them in some shape or form.